Did you know that parents rank teaching financial literacy as the toughest life skill? That's where Greenlight comes in, the debit card and money app made for families. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and track spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn how to earn, save, and spend responsibly, while parents have peace of mind knowing smart money habits are being built with guardrails in place. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/Wondery. That's greenlight.com/Wondery.
Parles-tu français? Hablas español? Parli italiano? If you've used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based techniques teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world. With lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers, Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Wondery. Spelled BABBEL.com/Wondery. Rules and restrictions may apply.
An entire family disappeared from Independence, Missouri, but it took 5 months for anyone to report it. And then the police determined the parents were actually on the run and closed the case, having never made contact with them. It would take a family member doing her own investigation to get the case reopened. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to today's episode of the 12 Days of Crimelines, where I cover 12 missing persons cases in the month of December. Last episode, I forgot to mention that these will still be ad-free for Patreon, Supercast, and Apple subscribers, but they aren't going to be more than a couple hours early. Part of that is just the workload, and I'm basically doing these as they get released. But part of it is also how Apple shows premium content. It makes it harder for everyone to find the episodes if I flood it with ad-free stuff every other day. It works fine when I release it weekly, but when I'm releasing multiple episodes a week, it makes it just too hard on the average listener to find what they can listen to for free. So if you listen on Apple and you see a paywall version of a 12 Days episode pop up, just sit tight because the free ad-supported version will be out in a few hours. So, with that out of the way, today's case is an older one, and it is from the area I live in, so I really wanted to cover it. It is one of the few I'm covering this month where I think there is a high likelihood that at least two of the people we're talking about are alive out there, and that means it needs more coverage and more awareness. We're going to start out with Freda Loretta Denman, who was born in November of 1947, and she was baby number 7 out of 11 children. And if you think that is a lot of kids, you're right, it is, but not to her father, Lloyd. He was actually one of 24 children. I thought I surely miscounted, but there were entire write-ups about the family in the newspaper archives because they were the largest known family in all of Wisconsin. Lloyd's parents had their first baby when they were around 16 and 18 years old, and they had their last baby in their mid-40s. They had 5 sets of twins, and was common at the time, they gave them matching names. Lloyd was one of the sets of twins, and his brother's name was Floyd. And Floyd and Lloyd were born just 13 months after the first set of twins, Clarence and Clara, and there were 3 kids older than even them. So 7 kids ages 6 and under, and then they kept going. Anyway, that's a whole rabbit hole I went down that has nothing to do with the rest of this episode. But since I was knee-deep in the newspaper archives at newspapers.com, of course, I thought I would share what I learned. So Lloyd and his many siblings were raised on the family farm in Wisconsin, and then he married Minnie, and they began their own large family, also raising all of the kids in Wisconsin. So Freda grew up there, but at some point in 1969, when she was 21, she found herself in Chicago. Chicago is not an unlikely place to find a Midwesterner. It is our big city after all, and Though we don't know exactly why she was there, the reports are that she was just passing through when she was at a bus stop and met a 34-year-old charming man named Michael Johnson. Except he wasn't really named Michael Johnson. It's possible that Freda knew his real name, which was Henry Lee Harbison, but she may not have. We really don't know. After they met, they quickly started a relationship, and Freda stayed in Chicago with him. She found out she was pregnant in early 1970, and then she and Henry moved down to Mobile, Alabama. Their daughter, Sheri, was born there on September 21st, 1970. In 1971, Henry was sent to prison in Alabama for forgery and counterfeiting. The state knew him as Michael Johnson, so that's the name he was convicted and sent to prison with. Had they known his actual identity, he probably would have served more time than the 22 months he did. Using the identity of Michael Johnson acted like a fresh slate for Henry because as Henry Harbison, he had a criminal record going back to when he was just 17 years old, and he spent most of his adult life in federal prison. He probably got in trouble before he was 17, but this was when his arrests started appearing in the newspapers. Over time, he would be accused of hundreds of burglaries, armed robberies, and car thefts. Henry Harbison was born in 1935, and according to a 2014 Kansas City Star article, he was adopted by a couple in Independence, Missouri. Thanks to the old practice of newspapers publishing people's addresses along with their names in articles, I have figured out who those parents were by cross-referencing various articles. Also, thanks to old newspapers publishing when random people visited other random people, it appears he was adopted at or near his birth because, according to the local paper, his parents were visiting family with their new baby the same year he was born, and he was their only child according to the U.S. Census. But the first time I found Henry Lee Harbison's name on its own in the newspapers was in May of 1946. He was 11 years old and headed on the train for a trip to Missouri's capital, Jefferson City, and he was going alongside his 6th grade class. He told the newspaper he was looking forward to seeing the Missouri State Penitentiary while they were there, which I think is wild given where his life was headed after this. The next time I saw his name pop up, aside from general school announcements, was in 1950 when he was about to turn 15 years old. By this point, his parents had divorced and his father was remarried, and based on census records, Henry was living with his father and stepmother. The police caught Henry trying to break into his own home, but he told them it was because he had forgotten his key. That's a very reasonable explanation, but given that he soon started breaking into other people's homes and businesses, I have to wonder if he wasn't just practicing. After this, Henry shows up in the newspapers next in 1952, and this time it's for actual crimes. Henry had enlisted in the Army, but he didn't seem to like it much, so he went AWOL from Camp Stoneman in California at the age of 17. So he was wanted for that, and he turned up in Dallas where he was arrested on Christmas Day 1952 and charged with burglary, armed robbery, carrying a concealed weapon, auto theft, being AWOL, and they placed him on hold for the FBI because he was wanted in other states for auto thefts. It sounds like his sentence in Texas was very short before Henry was paroled because he was in Joplin, Missouri to get arrested again on March 30th, 1953. He was initially arrested for breaking into a tailor shop and then selling the stolen clothes to a pawn shop. But the car he was driving turned out to be one he had stolen in Kansas City, Kansas, and he had driven it to Joplin. It is my duty as a Kansas Cityan to explain how Kansas City works every time this comes up. Yes, there is a Kansas City in Missouri. That is the bigger city, the one with Union Station and the Royals and the Chiefs. And there is a Kansas City in Kansas. It is a suburb. The cities do border each other, but they are not the same city straddling two states. I see people online asking, how having a city that's in 2 states works, and I'm here to tell you it doesn't work. They are separate cities. Except for the fact that they border each other, it's not unlike there being a Springfield in Missouri and a Springfield in 30-something other states. For the record, Kansas City, Missouri was named first. Kansas City, Kansas was named to try to benefit from the booming larger city next door, and I'm not sure how that worked out for them long term, but at least they tried. Anyway, because Henry stole a car in Kansas City, Kansas, and drove it to Joplin, Missouri, he crossed state lines, and the Dyer Act made this a federal crime. At just 17 years old, Henry was facing federal charges while being held in Joplin. He tried to give his name initially as Donald Johnson, but they quickly identified him as Henry Harbison. When they were taking him back to his cell after fingerprinting him on March 31st, the day after his arrest, he tried to make a run for it. He made it about half a block from the police station when he surrendered because an officer threatened to shoot him if he didn't. They were then holding him at the county court in Neosho while they waited to transfer him up to Kansas City to the federal court. About a week later, on April 9th, while he was still in county lockup, Henry decided to attempt to escape again. He managed to get his hands on a baseball, which he stuffed into his sock, and when the jailer, Bud Woods, came to his cell, he hit him with the makeshift weapon. The news accounts say that Bud was hit in the head and face, and he was in pretty rough shape. Henry changed into Bud's khaki shirt and left him to be found locked up in the cell, and then Henry made a run for it. We know he made it to his hometown of Independence, Missouri, because Bud Woods' shirt was found discarded at the scene of a burglary there. Henry was on the run for about a week. He ended up getting caught across the state in Hannibal, Missouri, when he tried to trade in a car he stole in Kansas City for a used car on a lot in Hannibal. Henry pleaded guilty in May of 1953 for various federal charges and got 7 years in federal prison. We know he was out by 1960 because that's when Henry got arrested again. He stole a 1959 Chevy in Kansas City and drove it out to Los Angeles, where he committed a number of burglaries and armed robberies of supermarkets. He then fled California and ended up checking into a motel room in Miami, Oklahoma on June 23, 1960. The reason he got spotted there was that the manager of the motel noticed that Henry stayed in his room all day and would only go out after dark. He thought that was suspicious, so he called the authorities. The police talked to Henry, and he gave his name as Charles Johnson. They ran the Missouri license plate of the Chevy, and it came back registered to Charles Johnson. At the time, Missouri issued license plates without recording the description of the vehicle, so they didn't initially realize that the plates were not supposed to be on a Chevy. Henry had swapped the plates from a different car, so this one would not come back as stolen. The police said Henry was confident and calm when they spoke to him, and he didn't give away even a hint that he was wanted for any number of crimes. Henry Harbison was truly a con man. By the time they figured out the car was actually stolen, Henry was gone again. He made it up to Iowa to steal a different car, and then he was caught in Kansas City with that stolen vehicle in July of 1960. This time, he was sent away for 9 years, and he was released in May of 1969, just in time to meet Freda Denman in Chicago, using his new alias of Michael Johnson. But as we know, he was not free for long before he got caught in Mobile for forgery, and he served less than 2 years behind bars before returning home to Freda and their daughter Sheri. According to a family member's post on Web Sleuths, Freda took Sheri and went back to Wisconsin in 1973, trying to get away from Henry. At the time, she was pregnant with their second child. Henry showed up to win Freda back, and family lore is that when charm didn't work, Henry threatened Freda that he would hurt her family if she didn't not only come back to him, but also marry him. So in late December of 1973, Henry and Freda took out a marriage license, and then in January of 1974, their son Michael was born. It's not clear exactly where Michael was born. He may have been born in Alabama, but we know that at some point in 1974, they moved back to Henry's hometown of Independence, Missouri. They were there by June of 1974 when Michael was 6 months old, and little Sheri was 3.5. Though they were back to where Henry grew up, he continued to use that alias of Michael Johnson, and even the kids were given this fake last name. Henry may have been able to hide in plain sight there because, for starters, Independence had grown considerably since Henry grew up there. In 1940, the population was around 16,000, and by 1970, it was over 111,000. As the Johnson family, they could just blend in with all the new families moving to the area. The second reason he likely avoided detection was that his father had died years before this, and his mother seems to have moved out of state by the 1970s. He simply didn't have a lot of family around to recognize him. And the third reason Henry Harbison was able to go to his hometown and live under an alias undetected was that he wasn't there for very long. It seems they likely moved there sometime after Michael's birth in January of 1974 and before June of that same year. We know they were there by June because that's when Freda got a job at a Denny's restaurant in Independence. She worked there until September before she then started at a different restaurant. And we also know that in this time frame, Freda was unhappy in her marriage to Henry. And we know that because of what she told a relative. One of Freda's brothers was living in the Kansas City area, and one day in August of 1974, Freda bumped into her brother's wife in a local store. As they caught up, Freda told her sister-in-law that Henry was abusive and that she was afraid for her life. She asked her to take care of the kids if anything happened to her. According to the family, the sister-in-law did not tell any of the family about this at the time because she was angry with her husband, who was Freda's brother. I'm under the impression that they were either separated or heading that way by this point. And Freda herself was not in regular touch with her family because, as happens in abusive relationships, Henry tried to limit contact as much as he could. Freda had a big family who could and would help her leave him if they knew what was going on, and Henry was not going to give her the chance to leave again. The next point we have on the confirmed timeline is Freda working her shift on November 9th, 1974, about 3 months after telling her sister-in-law how bad things were with Henry. Then Freda abruptly stopped showing up to work without notice. No one reported Freda missing until March of 1974, nearly 5 months later, and it wasn't just Freda being reported missing. The landlord who owned the house they rented called the police to say that the entire family had left and all of their things were left behind. The police went out to the house, and what they found was interesting. For starters, they found a TV guide on the couch, and it was open to Sunday, November 10th, 1974, the day after the last confirmed sighting of Freda. There were no signs in the house that anyone had lived there after that, like mail or newspapers. So why did it take the landlord over 4 months to call the police? One theory was that Henry just kept paying the rent, so it wasn't until March that the landlord realized they were gone. But knowing what a con man Henry was, it seems unlikely he would bother paying rent that far ahead. He was the type to just disappear and leave someone else holding the bag. The other theory, the one the family advocates have put forward, was that Henry intimidated the landlord into keeping quiet. Maybe he did pay some of the rent to keep the landlord happy, but we certainly don't know the whole story there based on what has been made public. Inside the closets of the house, the police learned that the family hadn't left everything behind. They found a lot of women's clothing. Pretty much all of Freda's items appeared to be there. However, Henry's clothes and Sheri and Michael's, most of those were gone. There was blood found in the house, but not enough to assume foul play. And back in 1974, they could not do DNA testing. They could only do blood typing. Some reporting has said it was not enough to get a blood type, but according to the book A Beautiful Child by Matt Birkbeck, it was type O, which is the same as Freda's, but not the same as Henry's. The investigation also pretty quickly led the police to the fact that Michael Johnson was really an alias for Henry Lee Harbison, who was wanted by the FBI at the time for what looks like a parole violation. In the end, the Independence Police concluded that Henry and Freda had simply picked up and left town, probably changing their names again, to avoid Henry being arrested and sent back to federal prison. So a few months after the 4 family members were reported missing, the missing persons case with the Independence PD was closed. The FBI had a fugitive on their hands, so it seems like the police department assumed it was the FBI's case. But then the FBI didn't go out looking for them either, possibly because it was just a parole violation and not a priority. So, literal decades passed with Freda's family living with this story of a missing sister and a niece and a nephew who they hoped they'd hear from at some point. As time passed, though, it is clear they believed Freda was dead. When her father Lloyd died in 1999, Freda was listed in his obituary as having predeceased him. And it was shortly after Lloyd's death that one of Freda's sisters-in-law, Sheri, decided to start looking into what really happened. Because the case was closed, she was able to get the case file from the police, and she is why we have as much information as we do. Particularly little details like the TV guide being open to a specific date. Something else Sheri found out about in the case file was an envelope that was found in the house. It had the return address of John Price of Iowa City, and it was a P.O. box that had been used for the Church of the New Song. The Church of the New Song actually comes up one other time in this investigation. Someone named Bud called Freda's work to have her last paycheck mailed to him in Iowa City. And there was a member of the Church of the New Song in Iowa City with that name. So what is the Church of the New Song? It really has a cult-like vibe to the name, but it's not quite that. In the early 1970s, an inmate in federal prison in Atlanta petitioned to have his church, Church of the New Song, recognized within the federal prison system. It was presented as a church that focused on prisoners' rights, but it has been accused of being nothing more than a prison gang that wanted religious recognition so that, 1, they could meet regularly and without as much restriction, and 2, get things they wanted that they couldn't just have as prisoners, like how they made a porterhouse steak part of their communion. They were recognized for about 2 years from 1972 until 1974, when they were officially disbanded within the prison system. Even though the federal prison system no longer recognized them as a religion, they did stay a loosely connected group, and that extended even outside of the prison. Though Henry was not in federal prison at the time the Church of the New Song was growing, he did know a lot of people from his years in the system, and he stayed connected to many of them after his release. So that connected him to the church outside of prison walls. As part of this network, he would let former inmates stay with him in Independence as they traveled through, and he knew that he could stay with anyone else if he ever needed it. Based on what was in the case file and what they've learned since then about Henry Harbison, Freda's family believes that Henry killed Freda in November of 1974. He hid her body and he took off with the kids. He then used his network of former inmates to hide out, change his identity, and possibly to offload the kids. Because let's be honest here, there isn't much about Henry Harbison that leads anyone to believe he would want to be a single dad to 2 small children. He probably, hopefully, left them with someone along the way. They were so young, Sheri was 4 and Michael was 10 months, that they could have been adopted into a family and never remembered a time before that. After doing her own footwork for a while, Freda's sister-in-law Shelley ended up getting this case reopened in 2004 with help from Senator Pat Roberts. Freda and the children were entered into NCIC as missing persons. Henry Harbison is not considered missing. He is still considered a fugitive. Getting this case reopened and publicity on it was made easier due to its light connection to a case I have covered previously, the Suzanne Savakis kidnapping and later murder. I covered the case back in Season 2, Episode 12, but since then there was a documentary released called The Girl in the Picture that I definitely recommend. I also recommend the books A Beautiful Child and then its sequel, Finding Sharon. Both are by Matt Birkbeck, and they are the most detailed coverage you will find on that case. It is an incredibly complicated case, but essentially, a woman identified as Sharon Marshall was killed in a hit and run in 1990. This name turned out to be a fake identity. She was estimated to be the same age as Freda's daughter Sheri, and Sharon had a son she named Michael, which was the same name as Sheri's father's alias and the name of her brother. And those are the people you often name your children after. So there was some speculation that maybe Sharon and Sheri were the same person. Because of this connection, the book, A Beautiful Child, spent some time discussing Freda, Sheri, and Michael Johnson's disappearances, and it got more attention on the case. But it wasn't just the age that connected Sharon and Sheri. Franklin Floyd, the man who kidnapped Sharon as a child and then killed her 15 years later, was also affiliated with the Church of the New Song. And while he and Henry Harbison were not in prison at the same time, they were in Chicago at the same time. And Franklin Floyd told Matt Birkbeck, the author of A Beautiful Child, that he did know Henry, but that Sharon was not Sheri. DNA tests later confirmed that Franklin Floyd, for once, was telling the truth, and Sharon was not Sheri Johnson. She was eventually identified as Suzanne Savakis, a girl Franklin had kidnapped from a woman he was dating, raised as his own daughter, married her when she was an adult, and abused her all along the way. So even though Sheri was not Sharon, this does raise a massive concern that this was the type of person Henry Harbison associated with. So what type of person did he give his children to, if that's what happened? The paper trail for Henry, Freda, and the children ended in November of 1974, and no recent developments have gotten the authorities closer to their whereabouts, or at least nothing that's been made public. Prior to fleeing in 1974, Henry had a hard time staying unarrested for very long. He was a charming con man, but we can't ignore the fact that he got caught frequently. He only had a couple of years at most between prison stints, so the idea he managed to completely stay out of trouble since 1974 doesn't really track. I have to wonder if he was arrested other times under different aliases. We do know that he used the last name Johnson frequently, and at times he used the first names Henry, Donald, Charles, and Michael with it, but we have to assume that he shed Johnson after he left the area, but we don't know what he could have changed it to. He did seem to like names that were very common, so I wouldn't be surprised if he started going by Smith. Freda, as far as we can tell, was never known to use any false identity. If alive today, she would be 78 years old. She is 5'7", and at least in her late 20s, she was slim and about 135 pounds. She has brown hair, and the missing persons websites have her listed as having brown eyes, but the family said they remember her eyes being hazel. She also has a dental plate. Sheri Lynn Johnson would be 55 years old if alive today, and Michael Lloyd Johnson would be 51. Both of the kids have brown hair and brown eyes. Henry Lee Harbison, if he was alive, would be 90 years old, so it's likely he died under whatever fake identity he had at the time. That said, people he knew through the Church of the New Song could be 70 years old right now and still alive. Their children, who may have met him along the way, are likely still alive. Reports are that the rumor in the church was that Henry had killed the children as well as Freda, but there is no proof of that. The truth is, those people may have had a motive to lie. If the children were taken in by someone in the church's circle, they wouldn't want to expose that person to criminal prosecution. And if the kids stayed with Henry, they may be protecting his location as well. DNA for Freda, Sheri, and Michael is available for matching, and it has been entered into CODIS. According to the Doe Network, there are not fingerprints for the three, but I wonder about Henry because he was in federal prison before this. Surely they have his prints on file, and maybe one day they'll get a match to someone who was arrested somewhere along the way. We saw fingerprints work in 2006 to identify Wilma Nissen, who was found as a Jane Doe in the 1970s. You really never know when the technology and the databases are going to catch up and start making more matches. But in the meantime, if you have any information on the disappearances of the Johnson family or where Henry Lee Harbison went after he left Independence, Missouri in 1974, you can call the Independence Police at 816-325-7300 or NCMEC at 1-800-THE-LOST. These numbers will be in the show notes.